So ladies and gentlemen, students, welcome to everybody. We're very pleased to have the finance minister of Germany with us, Christian Lindner. Christian Lindner is also the chief and the leader of the FDP, the German party for the liberals, or the Free Democratic Party, an advocate for the free society. And I'm Markus. I'm the director of the Bentham Center for Finance and the professor in economics. And Mr. Lindner will talk about a liberalism for tomorrow, and will outline his vision. This is our liberal society, and our free society faces many challenges at the moment. It's under threat from many levels, at the local level and also at the global level. And just to mention some, cancel culture makes it harder to exchange ideas. Social media distorts ideas. Industrial policy is abused for protectionism. And we also have new technologies, artificial intelligence. It might lead to something like AI-cracy, like an autocracy, that the autocracy can control our way we express ourselves and how much we can make free decisions or not. So citizens' freedom and privacy is potentially constrained. So I thought I also use AI. I use ChatGPT to find some fun facts about Mr. Lindner. And I can't vouch that it's actually correct, because ChatGPT has some hallucinations. But it told me that he's known for his love for fast cars. He owns a Porsche 911. Not sure whether that's true. But I double-checked that he's a proponent of classical liberal economic policies and often cites Friedrich Hayek. I double-checked that. That's correct, at least. So today, the minister just arrived from the IMF World Bank spring meetings, and he will bring us the newest take, what's going on in the global economy, in a global world order, and how we can make it more resilient in the presence of so many shocks our society is facing. And before that, he just had a 36-hour marathon negotiations in Berlin among the coalitions, so he can handle without sleep. He doesn't need sleep to do these negotiations, and is surely on high demand. So we're very pleased, therefore, that he spent some time with us, and he came specially for us here to outline his vision about liberalism here in Princeton. And I'm very pleased for all the help from the center to organize it. Also, Bentham Center co-founded this with the Ludwig Erhard Forum in Berlin. So thanks again for coming, and enjoy the feast, and we're looking forward for your presentation. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Neither have I come with my Porsche, nor will I be delivering a speech for 36 hours today. Dear Professor Brunnermeier, dear students, dear guests, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to Princeton, an institution where so many leading scholars have studied, researched, and taught, and continue to do so today. Important German-speaking economists such as Friedrich Lutz and Oskar Morgenstern came to this university in the late 1930s, where they found refuge from the Nazi regime, a fact that at the same time reminds us of the darkest hours of German history and of the liberal character of Princeton. So it is an honor to be here today in the company of so many bright students and distinguished guests. For Germany, it is a matter of pride that one of the influential professors in Princeton is our compatriot. I owe this invitation to speak to you today to Markus Brunnermeier. Thank you for this opportunity, Markus. Of course, he invited me less because of who I am as person, and more because of the office I hold as Finance Minister of Germany. I'm completely aware of this. And I imagine that could also be the main reason you are here too. which also means it would have been obvious to me to talk about current international financial policies. I won't do so. You have spoiled it already. I'm not only a finance minister, I am an advocate of the idea of freedom. And even if it entails a risk for the success of this event today, I feel that a different focus is more urgent than international financial policies. The United States has always been a global beacon of freedom. You will doubtless be familiar with the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The 1776 Declaration of Independence is uncertainly one of the most important documents for liberal philosophy of government. Of course, US politics has always been subject to controversy, but for some time now, the liberal order itself has been questioned and challenged as never before. Let's put it this way. Liberalism is said to be failing politically and intellectually. This is why I decided to speak to you today as an advocate of the idea of liberty and as someone who earlier studied political science and philosophy. I want to sketch out why and how liberalism has a future as an idea for structuring human coexistence by addressing the major attacks that are made against it. And I also want to talk about why the future of human coexistence should be shaped by the idea of liberalism. Just to avoid any misunderstandings, many of you will have heard the term liberalism in a different context. So I kindly ask you to put US domestic policy discussions aside. The semantics of the term liberalism is not the same in the United States and in Germany. In your country, in this country, my impression is that some in the political public sphere do not use the adjective liberal as a compliment. Rather, it is used to describe the left-wing role of a state that actively corrects the market and is mostly framed negatively. The German understanding is closer to what might be called classical liberalism. In terms of the history of ideas, however, I think it's a negligible semantic problem for the purpose of my lecture today. Is there any liberal doctrine that is widely shared in all its aspects? Hardly. But at least one undeniable characteristic can be gleaned from Scottish philosophy, the French Revolution, the German Enlightenment, the aforementioned American independence movement, and all that followed. While liberalism places the individual center stage, other philosophies follow collectivistic values. Communism, for example, sees individuals primarily as part of their classes. Republicanism calls for a common will. Communitarism for traditional community of values, and ecological thinking focuses on nature. This means that today we are talking about individualism. And from the notion of individualism, it follows that freedom is a necessary condition, because a life in dignity under the dictate of others would be unthinkable. Self-determination over our own lives, freedom of speech, and property are rights that are guaranteed for all individuals in the liberal order. Individuals have equal rights. Where they differ is what they make of their rights. This means a free society can therefore never be homogeneous. On the contrary, the idea of homogeneity would be an authoritarian one. It would take too much time here to present all attacks and the complete literature against liberalism. It's boundless, you can trust me. In brief, we can say that the left accuses liberalism of being responsible for exploitation, poverty, and inequality. This is why it has an anti-democratic effect by virtue of the economic power it unleashes and natural resources it consumes. And the right accuses liberalism of destroying traditions and cohesion as well as cultural and national identities. We should not dismiss these criticisms lightly. Yes, some are simply absurd, but others describe social developments that are wrongly attributed to the liberal order, although we liberals should rightly be rejecting them as well. Unfortunately, liberalism has a number of real opponents as well as foul friends who want it to morph into an entrenched ideology. But what lies at liberalism's core is its capacity to learn, but we have to learn. Its faith in progress as an incremental process of human civilization is key. So let us first take a look to the criticism from the left. Norberto Bobbio, who had been an Italian scientist, Norberto Bobbio once ordered the left-right scheme based on the ideas of egalitarianism and anti-egalitarianism. Leftish thought then is concerned with material inequality. The gap between rich and poor is growing. What emerged is an aloof and privileged upper class that no longer has anything to do with the lives of the majority. Indeed, in many societies, we can see such a proliferation, not only in capitalist systems, by the way, but also among systemic rivals. Certain voices in liberal literature tend to shrug this off. If you have a constitution that guarantees the freedom of contract and property, so they say, then you have to accept inequality. The liberal order is a process. Moral aspirations are alien to it. This position was mobilized in particular to put it at a distance from John Rawls, whose theory of justice could not be ignored in political philosophy, and certainly not at Princeton, where he began his academic career, as you know. An order that is not perceived to be just by those who belong to it cannot be expected to be stable. If political theory is not convincing in practice, people will reject it at the polls or vote with their feet. For Adam Smith, whom you certainly know, one of the founding fathers of liberalism, ethical sentiment played an important role at the level of the individual. He dedicated his first work to this. It was only later in The Wealth of Nations that he presented the work that, with the concept of the invisible hand of the market, laid foundations of economic theory. The inner connection between both books remains subject for the history of philosophy. In any case, political practice has provided the empirical evidence, and economics has long since distanced itself from the concept of the ruthless utility maximizer. Two aspects of Rawls' theory of justice are important for my considerations today. First, his emphasis on equality of opportunity. In my words, social positions are assigned according to merit and not origin. And second, the principle of difference, which accepts inequality, again in my words, when the dynamics of the order produces so much wealth that even the weakest member of society will still benefit from it. In other words, nothing is gained if everyone is equal, but everyone is desperately poor. What do you think? My impression is By these standards, liberals still have a lot of work to do. Equality of opportunity has not been achieved. In Germany, for example, your family background is an important determinant for your path in life. By contrast, it would be fair if differences in intelligence, diligence, and willingness to take risks were the factors that determine a person's place in society, rather than, as Rawls said, the natural lottery of birth. I am convinced that access to education is the essential resource in this regard, and we need to invest more in cases where people are particularly disadvantaged from the outset because of their background. Because education improves social mobility. This is where state intervention has to focus on, so that the differences that arise later as a result of life choices are generally perceived as fair. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Stefan Kolev, not least because I think his biography provides us with a useful illustration of what it means not to capitulate to the lottery of life. I've known Stefan for quite a long time. We are from the same generation, but we grew up in different worlds. He was born in Bulgaria under the communist regime. Today, he is a professor in Germany. He is also the academic director of the Ludwig Erhard Forum for Economy and Society in Berlin. And last semester, he was here at Princeton as a visiting fellow in the Department of Politics. Dear audience, looking at Rawls' second principle, the current situation of the weakest members of society, it indicates that many liberal orders around the world are failing to live up to this aspiration. The great German liberal social scientist and politician Ralph Dahrendorf once demanded that no ceiling should be set for individuals, but that all should stand on the same floor. I'm convinced that such a footing includes, for example, access to health, protection in cases of personal misfortune, and the guarantee of a material subsistence level that enables people to participate in society. This requires the state to provide this social balance where the market does not. A liberal state also levies taxes, the revenue from which must be paid by the stronger members of society according to their ability to pay. In fact, in my opinion, it is only fair that the high performers also contribute a higher percentage of their income. Their success is based on stable conditions, opportunities for cooperation, and a civilization they were born into, and not the one that they have individually created. This limits the material differences resulting from the market process to a socially acceptable level. I fear I have to add something, since there are German journalists present who can probably hardly believe their ears when I express this conviction. I must add, for their benefit, in Germany, the level of social balance is more than adequate. Many positions on the left also confuse liberalism with a laissez-faire or anything goes philosophy. The Chicago Boys are associated with an image of so-called neoliberalism that accepts unlimited greed if it's pursed in conformity with the free market. There's no question that such positions exist, but this is a misunderstanding. Real liberalism is not a pro-business ideology, but a pro-market conviction. In 1931, 1932, Alexander Rüstow spoke of a new liberalism in contrast to what I will call Stone Age liberalism for short. And this new liberalism was in favor of a state that regulates the market through rules. More precisely, he called for a strong state, I'm quoting him, he called for a strong state that stands above the groups, above the interested parties, a state that breaks free from its entanglement with economic interests. I have no doubt that the historic audience at that time witnessed the birth of what we can now refer to the German school of liberalism, named Ordo liberalism, coming from the word order. Only a few months ago, the Chicago economist, quote him here, Luigi Zingales called for return to the spirit of this German liberalism, especially to its plea for general rules as a challenge to the quest on the part of some individuals for even more privilege in business and society. We need this form of reflection because freedom is threatened, for example, by the concentration of economic power, where platform businesses partly determine the success of others in an autocratic manner, and to which the state needs to respond by enforcing rules. It should have, the state, he should have the role of a referee, not a player. The state has to side with the newcomers and outsiders who must be given access to markets and opportunities for innovative upheaval. This requires an antitrust law with the real ability to prevent the accumulation of economic power. In the data economy, this is a prerequisite that I can only highlight here. As finance minister, I also have to look at the capital markets and the banks. Without going into details, the principle of responsibility is of particular importance here, as I am indeed convinced is the case everywhere. Responsibility means being liable for the free decisions we take. If a business decision works well, it is not for us to view that success with envy. But if a business decision fails, those that made the decision must be held accountable. The principle of the greatest possible level of individual liability for decisions is not only an ethical imperative, it serves as a natural restraint on risk that would endanger the system as a whole if they were to occur. In the capital markets, we have for too long accepted a situation where profits were privatized and losses were passed on to the general public, in other words, to you, me, to us. Now, let's look at the criticism from the right. Liberal individualism is blamed for destroying communities and traditional institutions such as the family. You don't have to go back to Pope Pius IX, who condemned liberalism as an aberration as early as 1864. You will find plenty of literature voices from our time. Emancipation, to use the Latin root, means to free people from the hand of others. The village of earlier eras, which formed a tight-knit community, but also confined people to a social role almost from birth, may evoke romantic feelings in some. But it was a hard enclosure that set narrow limits on self-determination. Emancipation and liberal society, on the other hand, have opened a horizon for many to live out their own needs. Nevertheless, it is not human nature to spend our lives like Robinson Crusoe. It's not about isolation as liberal atoms floating without ties. Rather, we need to create conditions that make self-selected communities possible. The basis for this are commonly accepted values of living together, especially respect for the life plans of others, and new social institutions to allow new and reliable boundaries. I cannot elaborate this today, so I give you one single example of a new social institution that brought diversity and social coherence together: the gay marriage. We have to find further new boundaries like this. Since plurality and diversity of our modern societies have been rising so much, I'm convinced that only liberalism is capable to keep us together and to foster societal peace. Ideas that try to restore the orders of the past would provoke severe social conflicts and cleavages. But we need to be vigilant. Some transform the idea of liberal individualism into a form of identity politics. And people identify themselves more as part of a group than as an individual. They underestimate the unique character of every biography. And naturally, we must forcefully oppose, for example, racism and other discrimination. But we must not allow restrictions on our fundamental rights to express our opinions and thoughts. The free speech initiative by the James Madison program here at Princeton is an important instrument to promote freedom of thought and free expression. What characterizes democracy and academia is the fact that one engages with different opinions in order to enter into dialogue with them. Universities in particular are places that protect opinions. They do not protect people against opinions. Let's imagine that we had turned this above described ambitious liberal agenda a reality in our societies. In this scenario, have we developed freely with fair opportunities in our tolerant, prosperous societies? Would that satisfy the aspirations of a liberal? By no means. Because if our aspiration really is to place each and every single individual, his and her dignity and freedom, at the center, could we then disregard those who do not live in our political contexts but in other regions of the world? Or those people who are not yet born? Their dignity and freedom also constitute an obligation on our part, which means we have to broaden our perspective geographically and temporally towards a universality of liberal values. While we here develop thoughts and ideas in peace and freedom, in Ukraine, people in mortal danger are fighting for exactly that, for peace and freedom. The last time I was in Kiev was before the corona pandemic. I had many conversations there. The main impression I had was as follows. The Ukrainians are people who decided against a future as a satellite of Putin's Russia and in favor of the community of liberal democracies of the West. The Ukrainians are people who decided against Putin's oligarch capitalism and in favor for our liberal market order. The Ukrainians are people who decided against Putin's authoritarian form of society with censorship and oppression and anti-pluralism, and in favor of democratic diversity and tolerance. Of course, there was then and is still, I met the Ukraine Prime Minister and Finance Minister today, and is still a need for reforms. No one knows this better than the Ukrainians themselves. Nevertheless, I'm convinced that Putin's unprovoked attack on Ukraine last year precisely happened because of the decisions the Ukrainians had made. And this is why we, as liberal democracies, are committed to solidarity with the Ukrainian people. This is the standard by which we must be measured in political terms on a daily basis. We live in a reality in which many societies do not share our ideas of human rights and freedoms. In our eyes, it looks like they even trample them underfoot. The concept of the universality of liberal values could therefore suggest the need for interventionalism that constitutes a continual commitment on our part to engage on ethical grounds, perhaps even by the means of military force and with the aim of regime change. There's no scope here to go over the controversial theoretical debates of the last decades about a possible liberal interventionalism. In reality, we, for example, experienced in Afghanistan that the attempt of regime change too often fails. Practical reason advise us to be reluctant with regard to interventionalism. Allow me to illustrate an alternative approach using an analogy between the global order and the internal order of liberal societies. Just as we operate on the basis of the individual's right to self-determination in our societies, we in the international community must assume that each of its parties has a right to self-determination as well, but that it doesn't justify silence or inaction. On the contrary. The idea of international law, liberal world order, common institutions, mutual agreements and connections grows out of the principle of self-determination of people. Regardless of any one people's power and size, all have the same rights and dignity. In this context, I recall a joke made by a former Prime Minister of Luxembourg who met the head of state of China. And he said, both of us, we are powerful politicians. Together, we govern over 1 billion people. Of course, it were just 640,000 inhabitants of Luxembourg in this 1 billion, but you got the point. No rules over any of the others. Institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, whose spring meeting in Washington I just attended, must exhibit the same commitment to all their members and to balancing diverging interests. Of course, in practice, power politics are still present within these organizations. But the conflicts are contained within the framework of rules and collective decision-making procedures. Therefore, in this sense, maintaining, strengthening, and where possible, reforming the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, international judiciary, and other bodies are priorities of liberal policymaking. And in situations where such international law is being violated, as is happening in such a horrific manner in Ukraine, no member of the international community can look the other way for ethical considerations and in their own interest, because they could be the next ones to be affected. If we will give all members of our societies fair opportunities to develop their freedom, this should be also our agenda at the international level. In terms of the universality of liberal values, however, we cannot stop here. We have to be a desirable role model for other societies. Changes in civilization can be supported through dialogue and cooperation, which in the long term lead to more dignity and freedom for individuals. On the world stage, there are major differences in terms of economic development. Wealth is extremely unequally distributed. We should all be concerned about that. The global south has also been particularly hard hit by the current economic eruptions. For example, the increased prices of food on the world markets or the problems of over-indebtedness in times of higher interest rates. On the other hand, this currently requires our support, as in the case of restructuring of high national debt. On the one hand, this requires our support, as in the case of restructuring of too high national debt. On the other hand, now, to achieve better long-term prospect, it is not support and solidarity that are needed, but cooperation. Globalization is often identified by the political left in particular as the cause of poverty. The narrative is that others are being exploited to ensure our prosperity. In fact, the global division of labor has already improved the living conditions of hundreds of millions of people around the world in recent decades. So our choice is not to reject globalization, but to work towards a more mature kind of globalization. I'm convinced that a reciprocal globalization model opens up sustainable opportunities for development. This model utilizes the division of labor in a way that we can not only support our goods and services to others, but in a way that we also open our markets to the products and services from other markets in return. And by creating the framework conditions that allow our companies can invest and create jobs in these other markets. Deglobalization and a reduction in the worldwide division of labor in terms of fragmentation would not create any new opportunities in life for individuals. Of course, this is also a challenge for our economy, because certain sectors would come under competitive pressure and evolve if the markets were liberalized fairly. I'm thinking, for example, of the agricultural sector, which often makes a strong case for its interests. Nevertheless, major difference in values will remain, some of which embarrass us as members of liberal societies. I only have to think of gender equality or social diversity. If practical reason also leads us to reject interventionalism from outside that seeks regime change, that does not mean that we have to remain silent. The method of choice is to engage in dialogue, absolute precisely these values, with challenging interlocutors. And to do so at every opportunity. Liberal voices within these societies need our attention and support to bring about change in civilization from within. That requires staying power. But we have to prove we have it. Despite having free trade, we must not allow free values to be disregarded. In order to avoid being misunderstood, I must add that the acceptance of different social systems in the world community finds its limits where genocide, for example, is systematically carried out in a state, as was once the case in Rwanda. This is where the entire global community's responsibility to protect comes into play and justifies the need for intervention on the basis of the international law. It is not only in terms of geography that the responsibility of the liberal extends beyond his or own sphere. The responsibility also extends in terms of time, because our descendants should have the same dignity and freedom as we do. We need to think about their rights today. So liberalism has an intertemporal responsibility. In the German forestry industry, the idea of sustainability was developed centuries ago. In line with this principle, a forest owner only felled the same number of trees that they could plant and grow in their lifetime. This is done so that the owner's descendants can also live from the yield of the wood. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, at latest, humanity has stopped adhering to this philosophy. we do not just fell more wood than can grow back. As coal and gas and oil, we even burn the underground forests that grew millions of years ago. In doing so, we are not only consuming humanity's absolutely finite resources, we are also provoking global warming that is potentially deadly for future generations. German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk speculates that Prometheus, who according to the Greek mythology brought fire to humankind and was thus the founder of civilization, must now feel remorse. The use of finite resources is probably inevitable as part of the process of civilization, because knowledge about alternatives first has to be developed. However, their use is only sustainable if, in the course of progress, technological innovations are being produced at the same time and which later make others and equivalent forms of living and economic activity possible. This applies not only across time, but also within the world community. The developed economic nations with their historical and still high emissions thus have a kind of obligation to innovate in respect to other regions of the world. Combating global warming is a question of survival of humanity. It will require far-reaching changes in our way of life. I'm convinced that technological progress in the field of decarbonization will allow us to do so without sacrificing freedom and prosperity. In Germany, for example, we have set ourselves the task of switching our energy supply largely to renewable energies such as solar or wind, which are therefore called freedom energies. Freedom energies in two senses, because they make us independent from gas imports from Russia and protect the interests of further generations, future generations. The transformation of the economy and society provokes conflicts. Jobs could be lost in certain sectors. Companies still want to continue to make profits with fossil technologies, and the purchase of new technologies, new cars or heating systems, a current debate in Germany, puts the burden on private households. With noble motives, climate activists nevertheless advocate massive restrictions on freedom and the need for restraint. This approach not only endangers support for measures that are necessary to protect the climate, this approach also carries with it the risk of a change of our liberal society. The German social scientist Ulrich Beck stated a few years ago that his friends from the environmental and climate movement possess a fatal proximity to authoritarian Chinese state capitalism, a sympathy for control from above. And I think he is recognized more or less a left-wing social scientist. More recently, we heard calls for democratically elected parliaments to be supplemented or even replaced by councils determined by the drawing of lots to make decisions after consultation and facilitated by experts. What sounds like friendly deliberation is in fact the replacement of democratic representation based on the participation of each individual through the subtle exertion of influence and the possible distortion of majority voting. Liberals must offer alternatives. Combating climate change and protecting the environment are liberal concerns, but at the same time, the path must be compatible with liberal values. Two things follow from this. If we weren't ambitious about climate protection today, as the German Constitutional Court argued some time ago, the pressure to adapt would be unbearable for our descendants. Global warming and the consequences of global warming mean that, in order to ensure survival, even greater restrictions on freedom would become inevitable later on. However, contrary to what is sometimes said in the political debate in Germany, it does not follow that we have to accept massive restrictions on freedom ad hoc in the present. Rather, it is about an intertemporally fair distribution of change. I'm convinced that technological change, which is already demonstrating exponential progress, will facilitate a balance, because we are laying the foundation for innovation today. We present people with the prospect of affordable alternatives for their free life choices. In doing so, we simultaneously secure the democratic majority's support for climate protection measures. What is needed then is to put the adaptation in a long-term perspective. To achieve the adaptation, and this is the second liberal position, we must mobilize knowledge. This would be the place to quote Hayek. The competition of ideas that exist in the market economy is the most effective instrument for producing superior and efficient solutions, as you know. If the emission of CO2 becomes a scarce commodity through issuing certificates, its price will be increasing. There is thus a direct incentive to make economic decisions and find technological solutions to reduce CO2 emissions and ultimately avoid them altogether. This means policymakers do not need to get involved in the choice of technology, but can restrict themselves to defining targets. The European Union has embarked on this path with the trading of such emission rights. Now, all it would not to do is trust the instrument already chosen, which is still only partially the case. Ladies and gentlemen, I have attempted to describe the contours of liberalism in keeping with the times. It is a frame of thinking that has a future if it takes the arguments of its opponents seriously, but without giving in to them at the same time. In the end, however, the core remains, namely the commitment to the dignity and freedom of the individual. I hope I have at least succeeded in making it clear that the starting point of individualist liberalism is nevertheless not I, but you. The ethical quality lies in the fact that we grant others the same rights that we grant ourselves. When asked what is at issue, the liberal will answer, you. Your right to be happy in the here and now. Your opportunity to take your life into your own hands. This is the way. Thank you very much. Ja, klar. Thank you very much.
Microphones here, and who would like to come to the microphone?
Oh, I can come to you. Yeah.
And the students should have priority, but if the students don't come forward.
And of course, as I know here are some senior scientists and economists, of course you may ask questions about international financial institutions and policies. Okay.
It would be good if we could cue on the microphone.
I don't know if it's on. Use this.
All right. So my question is, given the high inflation and cost associated with supporting Ukraine and investing in weapons for them, defeating Russia in the end, should the urgency of investments into renewable energy in the European Union change? Should we give more investments into combating inflation and costs associated with supporting Ukraine, or should the investments and the goals that the EU has in terms of renewable energy stay the same? Thank you.
Yeah. So this is even better. So thank you very much for your question. The ambition to mitigate climate change within the European Union mustn't be reduced. For me, a climate-neutral economy could be an economic advantage. If we develop the innovative technologies for climate neutrality, it does not only reduce the level of emission within the European Union, could be interesting for other regions of the world as well. So we have to organize growth through green and digital transition. Second remark, at the moment, the priority is fighting inflation. We need price stability. There is a connection, as you know, between price stability and financial stability. So this is key for policymakers. We mustn't intervene monetary policies of the central banks by spending public sector money, by making further debt on an already high level. So we have to cut costs, and we have to return to a path of deficit reduction and reduction of debt to GDP ratio. What is not too easy, I can tell you. Finance ministers are the loneliest members of the cabinet. Yeah? And I once made a joke that if finance ministers come together, it's partly therapy. And because our colleagues in cabinet, well, they haven't experienced yet an era of reducing public sector expenditures. Most of them came into office just before the pandemic, in an economic situation of historical low interest rates. For example, my predecessor spent 4 billion euros on servicing past debt. I have now to service debt of the past with 40 billion euros a year. And this changed over only 2 years. So they have never experienced something like this. And during the pandemic, okay, so anything goes, no problem. And third remark, we have to stay shoulder to shoulder to Ukraine in this crucial moment. I'm convinced, as I said, they do not only defend themselves, they defend the international rule-based order, the idea of liberty, us as well. And so we mustn't allow Putin to win this war. We managed to bring the fund, the International Monetary Fund, and other international financial institutions to help Ukraine with certain financial instruments. And this is why I'm convinced that Ukraine will be durable and they will be capable of winning this horrible war. Okay, I make just choice, okay? Now you. Yeah, okay. We have to be diverse. One with tie and one without tie. Male, female. Yeah? No, please.
Thank you very much, Minister. I wish I were a student, but thanks for giving me the mic. My name is Federico Fabbrini. I'm a visiting professor here at Princeton and a professor of EU law in Dublin. So I wanted to ask you a question. You've covered lots of ground in your presentation, but you've spoken about ordoliberalism. And that connects obviously very much with the architecture of economic governance of Europe and the euro. And so the question I wanted to ask you is, of course, economic and monetary union in Europe has changed profoundly in the last 2-3 years in response to the pandemic with the creation of Next Generation EU, which have arguably changed the paradigm. Would you be in favor of returning to a strict ordoliberal idea of EMU, or do you think that changes are positive? And in this regard, what do you think of the proposal by President von der Leyen of a European sovereignty fund? What do you make of it in light also of what you just spoke about, the green transition and so on? Thank you.
Well, I have to briefly explain. Next Generation EU is a pan-European program to invest in green sector technologies and to foster the transition. It's about 800 billion euros in this decade. So you see, compared to the Inflation Reduction Act, Europe has not forgotten how to spend money and to organize subsidies for our companies. This Next Generation EU program is in my eyes, once in a lifetime instrument. It's the exception from the rule during the pandemic. Now the money is no longer used in connection to the recovery after the pandemic. It's used completely differently, but this was the origin of this idea. And it's financed with EU bonds. And there had been a strong interest to issue common European bonds because they were cheaper than sovereign bonds of member states of the European Union. This situation is completely different. It's completely different. Now the EU bonds are much more expensive for many member states than their own sovereign debt, their own bonds. And I have to be very careful as finance ministers so that I quote media, voices in media, which are concerned if it will be possible to issue all necessary bonds to finance Next Generation EU. So this is not an idea we should follow in the foreseeable future. As I said before, accountability and responsibility are necessary for stability. If everyone thinks he or she can live on behalf of others, this won't be a stable situation. And so every member state of the European Union should stay responsible for their public budget. And furthermore, I'm convinced every member state of the European Union should be responsible for its economic development and the situation of the private financial sector. This stabilizes stability by accountability. Sorry, yeah, it's the same. Sovereign fund is the same. It's Next Generation EU 2.0. We don't need it. This is, by the way, very funny. Often I'm confronted by colleagues, well, Christian, we need a European sovereignty fund, and we need this fund and Eurozone budget, and then I asked, okay, for what? For what do you need these new instruments? And then they question me, what do you mean? For what? For what do you need it? For what do you need further European money? And you know what? No answer. Very often, no answer. The next generation EU funds are not yet completely dispersed. And some of the member states are not able to use the money because the absorption capacity of their economies does not allow to, because of lacks in the labor market or too long permitting procedures and so on. So the absorption capacity is lower than the accessible European money. And then further instruments, why? For me, it appears as if there is a solution looking for a problem. And I would prefer to do it the other way around. Define the problem and then ask for the solution, which, by the way, could include private sector funding. Okay, next question. Yes, we are diverse, so.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Are you in favor of the way in which Emmanuel Macron describes the European strategic autonomy?
I'm very much in favor of the German-Franco partnership. We develop a lot of common initiatives. For example, for further efforts towards a capital markets union, for example. But the idea of strategic autonomy of the European Union, I fear, is naive. I fear it's naive. Look at the current situation on European soil. We have a deadly war. We have a deadly war with Russia, and Russia is a nuclear superpower. And security on European soil, without the strategic nuclear potential of the United States, at least, is unthinkable for me. It's not a realistic perspective. We need to be stronger. We need to be less dependent on certain supply chains. We have to be self-confident towards the US administration and the Congress. But I've no doubt we need a very, very, very close cooperation to the United States. For me, United States and European Union are partners in values and should be as well partners in trade. And the idea of strategic autonomy or sovereignty, it is, well, a quote of Charles de Gaulle in my eyes. But even Charles de Gaulle, those days, denied to secure whole Europe with the nuclear potential of France. So don't misunderstand me. It's only the ultimate ratio to have strategic nuclear arsenal, but it is the last reserve in the case of an ongoing global crisis. And so I think we should stay together within NATO and other international institutions. Okay. Thank you. So I'm looking for further, not completely equally. Yeah, well, yeah. Yes, I see some mails. Okay. I come back to you.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is more general, and I don't know that it is even possible to answer it. But you mentioned how it's important to have dialogue when one seriously listens to the other side without giving up one's own values. And so I get that. And you also mentioned to the first person with this question how having climate neutrality is actually an economic advantage. So it seems like especially intelligent democracies would also see that and aim for that and race for that. What is it about this general situation that drives entire groups of intelligent politicians to go exactly the opposite direction? In other words, I want to understand this other side. I mean, to hold on and maybe even drive up carbon usage or be against what you called freedom energies. It's almost like sticking the head in the sand, but that's not a flattering way of looking at it. I'm sure there's some other driving forces behind it, and I'm just picking your brain on it.
Thank you for this really difficult question. What are the motives? I think the motivation is clear. Those politicians want to be re-elected by using short-term arguments. And I fear there are even politicians who know what is the truth, but telling their municipalities and the public the exact opposite to get elected or re-elected. We have a word for this. It's populism. What is the reaction to this? I think debate and discussion. First measure, debate, discussion. Second reaction is we have to take seriously the fears, aspirations, the felt lack of respect of certain electorates. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this here as a guest in the United States, but it appears for me as an observer from the outside that the US politics for some time was focused on the very liberal values of Wall Street and the very, very liberal values of Hollywood. And the land between Hollywood and Wall Street, well, there are living and voting people. And to forget them could be a terrible political mistake. And they have their desires, their needs, their interests. They have to be won over for certain policies. And so you have to confront them with facts, and you have to offer alternatives. You mustn't tell people you will lose your job due to green transition. You have to offer a new job and a way of life these people can afford and want to lead. So my observation. So I think we have to get slowly to the finishing line.
Thank you. Well, maybe this would be a good question to get us closer to the finish line. As a big group of students that are here, you spoke about the US-European and the US-German relationship and that set of shared values. And so I'm curious, if you gave us one piece of advice as students who may go into the policy world, may go into the business world, what would it be to make sure that we maintain our relationship as citizens of the US with Europe and with Germany specifically?
We had advice.
Or just advice in general. What
So-
to bear in mind?
Yeah. So we need well-educated people with a global perspective in politics. But my advice is not to start a career in politics. It is to start a career in science or in the business world, and with that experience, you are much more personally independent to get, for example, into politics. And you can enrich political debates with additional perspectives which are not only focused on gaining voter success, but changing policies. So, thank you all very much. Good evening. Have a very good evening. Thank you.